So I looked at this reaction and I thought it was just another piece of evidence that we're reaching a point in this country where one half of the country doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the other. And we've been seeing that throughout this year. We've seen it in the civil disorder that greeted the federal government when it attempted to enforce immigration law in Los Angeles. We've seen it prior to Trump's second term in the chaos on our campuses. We've seen it in the assassination culture that has kind of sprung up on the far left, whether it's what happened to Charlie Kirk or whether it was the murder of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, by Luigi Mangione, or the 2 attempts on Trump's life.
This is Roger Zakheim, director of the Reagan Institute and host of Reaganism. Welcome. We're excited today to have Matt Continetti back to Reaganism, I think for the 3rd time. Matt, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
We're excited to have you today, and it's somewhat a somber topic. It is a somber topic, and it's on an article you published in the Free Press called "Who Will Stop America's Slide into the Abyss?" And of course, you wrote this after Charlie Kirk's assassination, saying that, at least the subheadline said, it was the most stunning evidence yet that America is becoming 2 nations. And you work at AEI, you focus on domestic policy, you wrote a very consequential book. We had a Reaganism podcast on it called The Right. And for me to read you look at this moment, obviously not just through the tragedy and this moment of political violence as far as what happened, but actually step back and say that, hey, this is a real turning point and America is becoming sort of this is divided and into 2 nations, really struck me. And that's what I want to get in today. So if you could, for our listeners and viewers, talk about why you feel like this was truly a watershed. I think those are the words you used, saying that that we're divided not only by politics, I'm quoting your piece now, but by culture, lifestyle, psychology, and a big word coming up, trigger warning for our listeners and viewers, epistemology. So just explain why this was a moment for you to lay that all out.
Sure. Well, I was shocked and stunned by the assassination of Charlie Kirk, as I think a lot of people were. But what I was also stunned by was the reaction to it on the part of many people on the left in the United States. That the reactions ranged from celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder in broad daylight in front of a crowd of thousands of young people. But there was also reactions that attempted to rationalize the killing of Charlie Kirk. There was an attempt to somehow spread the falsehood that Kirk's assassin was on the right, where, as all the evidence we have, indeed his own words, show that the assassin was someone who targeted Kirk because of Kirk's political views.
I don't know who you're referring to specifically, but certainly Kimmel was Jimmy Kimmel said this on his show, and we know the result.
Yeah,
now.
but it wasn't just Kimmel. There were a variety of people online, and even a Democratic congressman was saying that that Tyler Robinson, Kirk's killer, was a member of the right. So I looked at this reaction, and I thought it was just another piece of evidence that we're reaching a point in this country where one half of the country doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the other. And we've been seeing that throughout this year. We've seen it in the civil disorder that greeted the federal government when it attempted to enforce immigration law in Los Angeles. We've seen it prior to Trump's second term in the chaos on our campuses. We've seen it in the assassination culture that has kind of sprung up on the far left, whether it's what happened to Charlie Kirk or whether it was the murder of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, by Luigi Mangione, or the 2 attempts on Trump's life, or the attempt on Justice Kavanaugh's life, or the congressional baseball shooting where that grievously injured Steve Scalise. We've just seen this mount and mount and mount, and so I do think the Kirk killing was a watershed in that, I continue to see this in the reaction, is that many people on the left don't seem to even understand why so many Americans have been traumatized by what happened. And instead, there's just this kind of default to rhetoric about both sides, or time to turn down the temperature, even as people on the left continue to describe people on the right, such as Kirk, as hate mongers or fascists or Nazis. And that gap is what I was most concerned about when I wrote the piece, and I'm still concerned about it.
I could tell. And just to clarify a little bit more, I mean, a lot of what you just outlined a moment ago is the cases of political violence and other violence coming from the left against people on the right or people associated with the right. In the case of a CEO, so corporate America is the enemy, for example, of the left, far left. But when you talk about this, becoming 2 nations, right? It's not just one side involved here. So I know there's this idea of both sides need to tone it down, and that's insufficient. It's not meeting the moment, is what I hearing you say. And there's obviously this is a watershed, is your argument, but what about the other side? So does the right understand the left? Is just the left not understanding the right, or is it red and blue really just not equally, or also not understanding the other side?
No, I think you make a good point when you say, how does the right think of the left? I happen to think the right understands the left much better than the left understands
I was
the right.
curious about that. Explain that.
Well, I think on the day we're recording this podcast, there was a very good column by Barton Swaim in the Wall Street Journal just going through the coverage of Charlie Kirk's death. And Barton Swaim points out that the articles he read and analyzed from the liberal perspective had just no idea who Charlie Kirk was, what he meant for millions of people, what he actually believed. And I don't think that is symmetrical. Mm-hmm. I think it's an asymmetry. I think if you've been on the right, you've had to understand the left because of its preponderance of power in so many key cultural institutions for so long.
What about the flip side, the point you're making that actually the right understands the left? How would you where's the evidence of that?
Well, I mean, I think you get to it whenever you read analyses of what the left is up to, or you hear, and I mean, there's just a greater awareness, I think, than there is in many parts of the left, mainly because, and this is something I talked about in my book. Historically, the left just pathologizes the right and just deals with the right as either the consequence of bigotry or religious reaction. It's not meant to be treated seriously. And the right has always, I think, taken the left very seriously. And I guess you could say that there are people on the right and in MAGA movement who, maybe exaggerate sometimes the threat from the left. But I do think this ignorance is asymmetrical. I think it's mainly the left just clueless.
Let me pull the thread. I want to pull the thread on this for a second, because I think I agree with you, and I'm trying to think of examples of that would demonstrate that the right actually is more sophisticated with the left, and perhaps we make a distinction. Certainly, people on the right make the distinction, and perhaps this is a distinction made nationally. But you have your Democrats, your sort of liberals, and then you have your progressives. You have the nuance within the left, and we talk about it in the context of political figures. right? You could talk about Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Well, that's a left of center governor, right? And Gavin Newsom, well, he's moving from progressive left and, sort of looking at the political winds, the opportunity perhaps to be the nominee. He's moving to the right, actually, and he's a relevant figure as we talk about Charlie Kirk. And then you have the progressive left, the progressive left, and that I think many on the right would call dangerous, concerning, the one that would, those elements in the far left that would seek to really overturn not just the institutions of this country. I wonder if there's a similar sort of, taxonomy that takes place from the left to the right. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. There's some people who do that and put that level of analysis on it. But I think that the reflex is to simply categorize anyone on the right, anyone who supported Trump, for example, in any of the elections in which he's been the candidate for president of the Republican Party, as beyond the pale, bigot, potential fascist or Nazi. And that is the context, I think, for the attempts on Trump's life, for the attempts on Supreme Court justices' lives, for attempts on congressional lives, and the killing of Charlie Kirk. And, there have been examples of the violence directed at Paul Pelosi. People mentioned January 6th. So, yes, there are incidents of political violence, but what we've seen in the past year, I think, is now almost 2 years, is a lawlessness that is welcomed or encouraged by the American left as long as it's directed to opposing and defeating Donald Trump and the Republicans.
Lawlessness that's covered by the American left at large, or the in your estimation?
Well, I mean, it just depends. I mean, people were excusing what was going on in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth Warren used the assassination of Brian Thompson as a way to talk about health care in this country, right, when it was not that at all. It should not be considered that. And people, Senator Murphy, used very strong language to describe the threat to Trump and what should be done about it. So, yeah, I don't want to make a categorical judgment,
right?
But this is the trend that I'm seeing.
When you describe this watershed moment, and you're saying it's not only politics, Matt, you also talk about lifestyle, psychology, epistemology, which are different ways of just saying, hey, this is an entirely different worldview in every way we experience life. Talk about that a little bit more, because so far in this 10+ minute conversation, kind of I've been focusing on the political actors we're most familiar with. We sit here in Washington D.C., we talk about it, but you're getting beyond the Beltway. You're going deep into the country, deep into red states, deep into blue states, and making this argument.
Well, I mean, just take a few examples. One is religion. We've seen the collapse of religious affiliation in the Democratic Party. A plurality of Democrats identifies non-affiliated or even secular. There are still, of course, religious Democrats, but they are a shrinking number, whereas the belief that religion is important, affiliation with a particular religion, practice of religion, that is a huge signal that you're on the American right or supporting the Republican Party. Epistemology, okay, that's ways of knowing, yeah, right? Think about the treatment of quote-unquote science, right? For the left, it's a conversation stopper to say that the science proves X, right? Whereas conservatives, Republicans, are much more skeptical about what experts say, and they're much more willing to challenge conventional wisdom. So,
which is really Trumpism. I mean, I don't know if that would have been a way you would have described, well, your book. Certainly conservatives since Reagan up until Trump, you would have, I don't know,
I don't know. I mean, I think the way that the left handled the climate debate pre-Trump was an example of this.
Science says
if you doubted, say, 100% human responsibility for global warming, or questioned the carbon cycle, you were immediately portrayed as a climate denier, using that loaded term. So I do think it's beyond Trump. Of course, all these things are magnified by Trump, and then culture too. I mean, just the fact that the Republican Party has become a working class party, primarily people who lack college degrees, and the Democrats have become the party of the educated elite. And of course, since education correlates with income, wealthier Americans, they're two different, different styles of life. And I think this is added to the cocoon that many progressives inhabit. They live in particular places. They come out of very particular career tracks and credentialism, and they look upon 50% of the country, 49% of the country, 49.7 or whatever it was that Donald Trump won in 2024, as benighted and not serious.
Mm-hmm. And how does it reverse? And so what's the mind? We were talking about this earlier. Sort of how the right views the left, and perhaps it's more nuanced. Or
I think the right is tired of the left. I think it's tired of the left. I think it's tired of the left's dominance on American culture and bureaucracy, and not quite dominance of the judiciary, but certainly still has a solid hold on it. When those institutions I just mentioned are really just reflecting and propagating the views of an actual minority of the country, I mean, a small minority. The majority of the Democratic Party identifies as liberal, but if you actually zero in on kind of what we would consider the core ideas behind the progressive left, whether it's socialism or equity or political correctness, Latinx, right, or the idea that biological men should be in women's sports, that's a minority of the country, and yet it's disproportionately powerful in our cultural institutions. And so I think what's happened over the past 5 years, Roger, is that the right, supporters of Trump in general, just have decided enough. I
was thinking about your article and this idea that we're two nations, and then we're having this event as the time is recording here at the Reagan Institute, our Reagan Institute Summit Education, and one of our speakers, and it was admittedly talking about talking about students, but I think it applies to this discussion as well, was saying that we are sometimes guilty of taking the pathologies that exist in pockets of our country, perhaps pockets of our country that are, kind of making the most noise and, getting the most attention, and applying it to the entire country. And so it was a discussion around students and education, that this is a generation that is anxious, that is addicted to their phones, and they're unable. And there's some there's evidence of that, but his argument is that we have to be careful not to sort of label them all that way, because I think he was saying that you end up identifying with that, and it's sort of self-fulfilling. And the other, I think he was saying that it's simply not entirely true, that there are pockets of, not pockets, but there's nice kind of pluralities in the country that don't kind of suffer from this. I was thinking about that in the context of your argument as well, that perhaps there's much of middle America where there's a lot of purple, and the pathologies that you're describing is really not reflected in their day-to-day life. The people are not watching Fox and MSNBC, or those who are not lost in the world of social media, whether it's a right platform or left platform.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's true. I think there's always a middle, but that middle is often silent, as a certain Republican president once put it, and also up for grabs. And I think when you look at what's happened in America over the last 10 years, you see that what drives history is energetic minorities,
Yes.
not necessarily the kind of satisfied small c conservative majority. But I would just also say that,
By the way, it was Ian Rowe, your colleague at AI, who's super thoughtful, and to
Yeah.
the extent he's listening, I apologize if I didn't, sort of capture his argument as eloquently. Or
I think that sounds fine. I just don't. I'm not sure. Think it's quite relevant to what I'm discussing. I've often cited the work of Morris Fiorina, the Stanford political scientist, who talks about how the vast body of our politic is not polarized, but at some point the people who are polarized matter for more. So one reason I'm been so distressed is the language coming from Pritzker, J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois. He spent the past month saying that Donald Trump is going to invade his state, and that Donald Trump is a dictator.
Yeah.
And that deploying the National Guard to Chicago, which, by the way, Trump has not done as of September 18th, and has actually said he doesn't have he needs the governor's permission.
Right.
Is somehow an alien force. That's the governor of Illinois. And the rhetoric that the mayor of Chicago uses is even more pointed.
Yeah,
At some point we have to reckon with that.
The rhetoric's in this particular issue. The rhetoric's crazy there. I think President Trump's post did a disservice to what he was seeking to do, right? Where he's, again, it's kind of meeting them right there in the same rhetoric. Given up, actually, the high ground, which I thought he was standing on, which is Chicago is a city that is besotted with violence at a scale without parallel across the country, and certainly in terms of homicides. It's nuts. And so for the mayor or the governor, to basically choose to challenge Trump as the authoritarian, as opposed to saying, hey, I need more help to deal with the fact that there are, I think, the city that has the next close number of homicides is about 150, 200 fewer than Chicago. It's a crazy number. That's what's nuts, right? The rhetoric's off the charts, divisive, and the people who suffer, the people who live in Chicago.
Yeah, you have governors of states saying they do not recognize the authority of the federal government. That is not healthy in the United States of America.
Yeah, I don't know if that's. I wouldn't put that example first, because
no, it is what it is, Roger. Because at root in all of these cases is the question of illegal immigration, and that's really what J.B. Pritzker is worried about. He's worried about ICE coming into Chicago and removing people who do not reside there.
But the president of the United States could do that right now, right? It's not like a.
He's doing that with ICE, and that's a separate question about whether the National Guard can become involved as well. But
right.
I think that's what the rhetoric that Newsom used when he opposed what happened in Los Angeles, and then it's what Pritzker's using. It's what this new compact between the West Coast states on vaccinations. Obviously controversial issue, but you have the same thing, states reaching compacts among themselves that are separate from and a reaction to, and in fact I'm going to use the word, nullification of what the federal government is saying. Historically, that is not a good recipe for the American project, and we need to address it. And then, of course, at the other, that's political.
Yeah.
And then what I was also describing in the piece is the cultural aspect, the fact that it is growing on the left, the idea that violence is an acceptable response to the rise of Donald Trump and MAGA.
And there's been some good pieces on this. You hit on it, this idea that one contributing factor to political violence on the left is the left had embraced, certainly progressive left had embraced this idea that language is violence. Right? that the word used is violence, and therefore people would make a distinction between actual violence, physical violence, and speech that's interpreted as being violent speech.
Yeah, and that idea of what's called assaultative speech has led to deplatforming individuals, to assaults on speakers at college campuses, even before the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And as we learned from the text messages that the assassin sent to his partner, boyfriend, that's exactly why he was killing Charlie Kirk, was because he disagreed. He felt that he needed to somehow silence Kirk's voice, which again is anti-American.
He said it was hate. This is sort of hate speech, and as a result, this was sort of the natural result or appropriate reaction. I guess we'll learn more about that as he's prosecuted. Let's turn to the sort of finding an off-ramp. So again, we're with Matt Continetti. This is his third time joining us on Reaganism, which we're grateful for. He's with the American Enterprise Institute and writes for the Free Press. His commentary, podcast is regular on National Review and elsewhere. So, what's the off ramp here? And for me, as I think about Charlie Kirk's assassination and the reaction afterwards, and who was speaking, what they were saying afterwards, is sort of the one who stands out. I remember watching the press conference, and the media journal had covered it as well. Covering the coverage, which seems to be a form of journalism now, covering the coverage of an event, is Utah Governor Spencer Cox. That he did opine in terms of what we need to do as a country, to move ahead and go forward in a positive way after this watershed moment. I don't know who stood out to you, whether you thought Cox was sort of the high watermark in that moment.
I thought Governor Cox has responded very well to this awful crime that occurred in his state. He had clear language explaining what was happened. He's talked about the problem, political violence, in a way that is meant to temper the passions. I think Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania has sadly had two occasions to address this. First, in a speech he gave on political violence.
Well, he's a victim of it.
Who, as I was about to say, he was himself a victim of it last Passover by a pro-Palestinian figure. And then there was this terrible killing of police officers in Pennsylvania as well, and Governor Shapiro gave, I thought, very good remarks about that. So that's one response, and that's the political leadership attempting to cool the passions and try to unify the nation around our certain fundamental principles, right, of viewpoint diversity and the rule of law. And I think that's very important. I do think that there's been another response, and that response is also, in some ways, I think, legitimate, and that is the response of the Trump administration, which has said, look, there's a threat here, and the threat in the case of Charlie Kirk and in the other cases against Trump and against Republicans is coming from this left wing, this militant and violent left wing, and so we need to take precautions and we need to take countermeasures in order to prevent and deter such attacks. And I think that's also legitimate.
So let's talk about that for a second, and then I want to talk about what you wrote in your piece in terms of the off-ramp turning point and how do we move ahead and somehow appeal to our better instincts as a country. President Trump yesterday said, posted on True Social, I am pleased to inform our many USA patriots that I am designated Antifa, which he called a sick, dangerous, radical left disaster, as a major terrorist organization. And then he's maybe also strongly recommending that those funding Antifa be thoroughly investigated in accordance with the highest legal standards and practices. And then, as he's wont to do on his post, he concludes, thank you for your attention to this matter. is that an example of what you were talking about?
It is. I mean, I think it's the kind of prelude to what will be coming out of the Trump administration. I think it's important that to note the difference between the first administration and the second. In the first administration, Trump would have put on Twitter a message like you just read. He didn't have Truth Social then, and nothing would really happen.
Right.
In the second administration, he will put out a message or post a truth, and his team will go into the details and say, well, how do we make this happen? So in the aftermath of that post you read, I heard from liberal media, well, what does he even mean?
Right.
There's no one organization called Antifa, this is silly. But my response is, okay, well, just hold your horses and see what happens after Trump gets back, because I think what the eventual executive order will be, it will be naming individual groups that fall under the umbrella of Antifa, and potentially even donors to those groups that the administration is going to be investigating and potentially designating.
And what is the designation here? So, I mean, I'm more familiar, kind of ironically, with foreign terrorist organizations. I guess this would be a domestic terrorist organization. I imagine it's probably more limited set of things you can do given our criminal justice systems and the due process involved there.
Yeah, again, right? I mean, it's Trump's kind of broad strokes communication method that then filters down into.
We'll wait for the EO.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then another one that sort of came out was the Attorney General spoke about going after those who engage in hate speech, and there was blowback on that from the left and the right, frankly, because Charlie Kirk was someone who actually, and I've heard clips since the Attorney General said this, the clips of Charlie Kirk saying, "Hey, I'm free speech extends to hate speech," and referenced how the ACLU would represent neo-Nazis. So that to me sort of was not the preferred response and the right response, the correct response.
Well, Attorney General Bondi walked back her remarks pretty quickly as a result of that criticism. This, of course, is not the first time she said something in public that has turned out to be something she regretted saying. I think it's an important point. Charlie Kirk was a free speech advocate. He was very skeptical, as many people on the right are, of granting the government power to determine what is correct speech or what is hate speech, right? Because that would be a potential infringement of First Amendment rights. That is not to say it's wrong to believe that people should face social sanction for celebrating or rationalizing Charlie Kirk's murder and other acts of political violence. And so I think that the Attorney General was wrong, and she appropriately walked back her comments. But I also believe that if a teacher, say, loses their job because they showed the video of Charlie Kirk's assassination to 10-year-olds, as happened in a school in Toronto, Canada, I'm not bothered by that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Government's role on that, though, really, this is sort of beyond the reach of government, I would think, the social sanction. Yeah,
well, I mean, it's sometimes, various levels, government employees might have more protections against facing the sanction, but I do think that it's a sign of, again, how much of the country just doesn't recognize the other as legitimate, that you would respond to Charlie Kirk's assassination by saying he deserved it or by saying great job. And if you say that, then you're inviting, I think, rebuke. That is non-governmental in nature.
Right. And they should face consequences, and the social isolation are consequences as they may be. I agree with that. Your take on sort of finding the off ramp is what you wrote. Is there a way back? I'm quoting you right now, Matt. I used to think that inspired statecraft could reverse the downward slide. I now believe that only a collective effort can do so. I think I can intuit why statecraft is no longer something that you think can get us there, but feel free to elaborate. And then what sort of collective effort do you have in mind?
Well, I think that our political leaders aren't quite up to the task. And I think that means that the culture is going to have to do it, and that individuals are going to have to do it in order to kind of reassert basic American concepts and principles and a shared understanding of citizenship in the United States. And it's not going to be easy because the ideas of America are under attack. The idea of citizenship is under attack. So it's going to just have to start from people, from families, and from institutions in order to remind younger people in particular that violence is not an appropriate response to someone that you disagree with.
Yeah.
And that it is not hatred to think that young people should not rush into changing their gender, or that biological men shouldn't participate in women's sports. I mean, these are, I think, pretty fun. Or that if you believe in God, that somehow doesn't make you a bigot.
Right.
These are the things I think that we need to reassert.
And a few of those things you just shared is part of the reason why President Trump was elected. I mean, this is
they're all why they're all why President Trump was elected.
So, the other thing that's involved here that I'm going to get your take on is sort of our institutions, the way our republic is organized under our Constitution, really does provide guardrails against all of this. The notion that there'd be political violence was not something that our founders hadn't contemplated, right? The notion that you'd have divisions, deep-seated divisions of two nations is something that our founders, right, were aware of and designed a republic to address. And then when it was tested, I'm thinking here, Civil War, we needed a great leader. We actually needed a statesman to get us through that. But also, we got through it. And then even in the 20th century, we've had suffered significant spouts of significant political violence. So how much? I don't hear you saying the sort of, hey, this is something we've been through before and we can handle it.
Well, we've certainly been through it before. You just mentioned a few episodes. I mean, I think the most recent episode was the late 60s and early 70s, and the spate of assassinations that we had, the bombings from the Weather Underground and such. We got through those. I'm always long America. I continue to be.
Yeah.
But the question is how? How do we get there? And, we don't want to have a civil war. I don't want to have a civil war.
Right.
So that's a failure when you get to civil war. And so the question is, how do we prevent it? And I think that's where I'm looking toward kind of a bottom-up approach in the classic American sense, as opposed to a top-down one.
It would be great, though, if our political actors rose to the moment. I mean, I think
we're going to have to wait for a different generation of political actor then.
Yeah. All right, Matt, we're going to go to our lightning round. Let's go to your favorite Reagan quote, speech, or book. So now we're going back a generation plus. Tell us what you're bringing with us today. And for our listeners and viewers, Matt is not only a very thoughtful commentator on our nation's politics and the policies that our leaders should adopt, but he's also a scholar of Ronald Reagan. So I'm looking for a goodie here.
All right, so my book, speech, and quote all come from one source, and that is this book that came out in 2020 The Heart of a Great Nation, Speeches of Ronald Reagan, with a foreword by then Senator Marco Rubio, now our Secretary of State. And I was drawn for this episode of the Reaganism podcast to Reagan's speech to the 1988 Republican Convention. And I'll just read a little bit of it. Our party speaks for human freedom, for the sweep of liberties that are at the core of our existence. We do not shirk from our duties to preserve freedom so it can unfold across the world for yearning millions. We believe that lasting peace comes only through strength and not through the goodwill of our adversaries. We have a healthy skepticism of government, checking its excesses at the same time we're willing to harness its energy when it helps improve the lives of our citizens. We have pretty strong notions that higher tax receipts are no inherent right of the federal government. We don't think that inflation and high interest rates show compassion for the poor, the young, and the elderly. We respect the values that bind us together as families and as a nation. For our children, we don't think it's wrong to have them committed to pledging each day to the one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And we have so many requirements in their classrooms, why can't we at least have one thing that is voluntary, and that is allow our kids to repair quietly to their faith, to say a prayer to start the day as Congress does? For the unborn, quite simply, shouldn't they be able to live to become children in those classrooms? That's one paragraph of one speech that I think basically sums up the Republican Party and conservatism at its finest, from Ronald Reagan.
Amen. Well said, Matt. Great to have you back on the
well
show.
Well said, Ronald Reagan.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Roger.